This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. I've been doing this portrait retouching series since the beginning of the year, and I was going to end it with the last episode, but I had a few comments and messages from some of you asking me to do a tutorial on how I produce a black and white conversion of the portrait that I've made. You might think that's too obvious a tutorial to do, because surely you can just hit desaturate and take the color out of the image and then you have your black and white. And whilst that's true, there's a massive difference between just desaturating an image, pulling the color out to create what is technically a black and white image, and using the color information underneath in the original image to create a black and white image with pop and shape and contrast to it. So in this video, which will be the last in this series, I'm going to show you my techniques for producing a properly toned, compelling black and white conversion for your portraits. And yes, whilst this series is pointed at portrait photographers, these techniques will work in any genre of photography, no matter what your subject matter. So hopefully these techniques will help you strengthen your black and white work. So let's jump in. Okay, so I pulled in this headshot and we're going to turn this into a nice dramatic contrasty black and white image. But just to show you the difference between the techniques, the first thing I'm going to do is come down here and just right click and go duplicate layer and show you that this is how a lot of people will convert their images to black and white when they start. They'll just come up to image, adjustments, and come down to desaturate. And that is obviously technically a black and white image, but you can see it's a little soft, a little flat. And by the end, we're going to come back to this and compare what we actually do with this very simple technique. Just by using a few extra tools, you can really bring a lot more mood and drama to your black and whites. So let's come down to the bottom, right click again, go duplicate, and we're going to pull this above that black and white layer we've created. So the first thing I'm going to do is come down here to adjustment layers and go black and white. And this is another technique that people use to make something black and white, is just to apply that black and white adjustment layer. And yes, it's technically a black and white image, but we can go so much further. So you'll notice we've got a lot of color sliders here, which might be a little confusing seeing as we've just gone to black and white. Why do we need these? But when you shot on black and white film in the old days, different films treated different colors in the scene by making some lighter and some darker. And if you watch the recent video with Jack Lowe, where he shoots using wet plate collodion and makes images on glass plates, he told us that that process means that anything that's a warmer tone in the image, like a red or an orange, will go really, really dark, and anything that's cooler, like a blue or a cyan, will go much lighter. That's how that process, even though it's black and white, treats the different colors in the scene. So we can use these to create more contrast. Now, if I turn this off, you'll notice that my background is cooler, it's blue. And if I know that an image is eventually going to be presented in black and white, I might make sure that my background is something cooler, because it's the opposite of the warmer skin tones and will give me more control with this process. So let's turn this black and white layer on. So let's start with those blues. If I dial this down, the blue in his shirt and the blue in the background is going to start to go darker. It's not affecting his skin. It's not affecting anything else, just the cooler tones. Let's do the same with the cyans, because there'll be cyans in there as well. And you can see, just with those little tweaks, we've already started to separate out these blues in the shirt and the background and darken those down. So we're selectively changing our contrast, but not affecting the skin tones on the face. And just something subtle like that looks pretty good, I think. We've just darkened those background and the shirt down. So the next thing I want to do, and this is a little formula that I would suggest for all portraits, but you need to use it lightly. In portraits, because our skin is usually some gradation of orange, no matter what race you are, our skin is basically somewhere on the spectrum of orange. And that means that in our shadows, we'll have red tones hiding, and in our highlights, we'll have more yellow tones hiding, because those are the two sides of that orange. So if we take our red slide and we dial it down, it's going to deepen the shadows on the skin. Can you see that? And then if we take our yellow slide and push it up, it's going to brighten the highlight side. So just by gently tweaking those, we can create a lot of contrast in the skin with the reds on the shadow side and the yellows on the highlight side. And again, less is more with this technique, because you might start to pick up some red blotchiness in the skin and you can overcook this, but just a little bit like that works very well. Next thing I want to do is come down here to adjustment layers, and I'm going to add a gradient map. Now, gradient maps I've covered in my tutorial on how to recolor things, but in this case we can use it really effectively with black and whites as well. So I already have a black to white gradient, but you might have something crazy when you open it like this. All you need to do is click on this gradient line and bring up this dialog box. And we're going to come here to our black and white, which will usually be the first one. And we can see at the bottom here, we've got black to white represented all the way along the bottom. Now this is a very strong effect. We're going to dial this back, don't worry about it. But basically what I want to do is if I click on my white here and drag it to the left, I can brighten that up to brighten up the highlight side. I don't want to blow any highlights, so just bring it back a little bit. I'm not going to pull the blacks over. You could, if it was still looking quite flat, start to pull the blacks over, but there's already a lot of very dark space in here. And then I want to grab this little node in the middle here and dial it. Okay, that'll often happen. If you slightly miss that node, it's quite sensitive. It's going to create a whole new node here and mess everything up. So just go Control Z and take that out. And make sure that you're grabbing that little node. Pulling it to the left in this case is going to brighten it up and bring in more of those midtones. And something like that looks pretty good to me. I want a lot of contrast, but not losing any detail. And then I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm going to come over here to opacity. And I'm going to dial it all the way down to 0. And I just want to start bringing this up slowly until I like the amount of contrast in the image. And something like that looks pretty good to me. Okay, then I'm going to add a curves layer above. You don't need to do this. I like to do it. This just adds a little bit more tone to it. I've covered curves in these tutorials many times, but again, just black points, shadows, mid-tones, highlights, and whites along this x-axis, and basically all your tones are represented on this curve. So I'm going to grab a highlight point here, and just pull it up slightly to bring up my highlights just a little bit and make my shadow point here and just bringing that shallow S-curve just down a touch. I moved it very, very slightly, but if I turn this on and off, you can see it's just added a little bit of tone in there. And the last thing I want to do, just to check that I'm not blowing anything out and everything is where it should be, I'm going to create a levels layer above. And by holding Alt and grabbing my white point here and dialing it to the left, I can see how far I can bring it before I start to lose detail. So, because I want a nice, crunchy, contrasty black and white, I'm going to bring this across until I start to lose detail and then dial it back and let it go. Let's see what that looks like. Looks pretty good to me. I like that. Because I'm not showing anything blowing out when I hold down that Alt, I know that I'm not losing any detail. That looks pretty good to me. I'm going to do the same with my shadow point. Hold down Alt, grab my shadows, pull it across. You can see where it starts to lose it. Again, in this, I'm already quite dark. I might just leave it. Let's just take it to 2. Very, very subtle. And that looks pretty good to me. I don't want to do any more than that. And then I just want to grab my mid-tone point here and just dial it around, see what I like. And I think just lightening that up slightly looks pretty good to me. Now, what I'm going to do, just to show you the difference, I'm going to hit Control, Alt, Shift, and E, which is just going to create a stamp visible layer above. I'm going to come down here and just turn all these adjustments underneath. And let's go back to, if I turn this off, this was the black and white layer that I created. Just by going in here to image and desaturate, that's what it looks like. And you can see how flat and kind of milky and washed out that looks. But using these techniques, a black and white layer, a bit of a gradient map over the top with the opacity dialed down, curves to tone and levels just to check those corrections at the end, you can see we've got something that's much more dramatic. And you can use this as strongly or as weakly as you want, but I like something with a lot of crunch to it. And I think these techniques really give you that dramatic look to your black and white portraits. I hope this video and actually this whole series have really helped you get a better handle on your post-processing techniques. And I have to say that I'm really proud with how this series has turned out. I know there are a lot of courses out there that ask you for a lot of money for a lot less information than I've given you here for free. And it's honestly the course that I wish I had when I was starting out. If you've missed out on the other videos in this series, I've put a playlist together for you on this channel covering natural skin retouching, enhancing eyes in your portraits, dodging and burning the light for shape, changing texture and color of backgrounds, and finishing your image with color contrast and sharpening, and of course this video on a black and white conversion. So you can always go back and find those videos presented in a systematic manner. And if you know people who you think would benefit from these tutorials and these techniques, please help me out by passing it around. I really have put a lot of time into this series, and the reward for me would be to see it help as many people as possible. And lastly, thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my website of choice for the last decade. One of the things I really appreciate about Squarespace is their e-commerce functionality. And I knew when I set up a website that I would want to have a store on there to sell things like I have on there at the moment, my Collection 5, which is my annual book of photography, and the audio version of The Meaning in the Making. But I was intimidated by the idea of taking people's money and keeping track of orders, and it just felt very overwhelming and complicated. But the back end of Squarespace makes it super easy to integrate with a platform like Stripe to take payments, to keep track of people's orders, and once they're shipped, to even let people have emails with all their tracking information in them, and it couldn't be easier. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.